6-foot-tall black man stood in the heart of feudal Japan, surrounded by samurai warriors who had never seen anyone like him before. Within months, he would become one of them. His name was Yasuke, and almost everything you think you know about samurai history is about to change. The year was 1579. Japan was tearing itself apart. Warlords carved up the countryside like a blood-soaked chessboard. Every castle was a fortress. Every alliance was temporary. And into this chaos walked a man who shouldn't have existed in their world at all. He arrived not as a warrior, but as a curiosity, a companion to Italian Jesuit missionaries who'd sailed from the Portuguese colonies in Africa. The Japanese had never encountered sub-Saharan Africans. Their entire understanding of the world didn't include people who looked like Yasuke. But here's what makes this story stranger than fiction. Within a year of arriving, this outsider would be given a sword, a stipend, and a place of honor in the inner circle of the most powerful warlord in Japan, a man named Oda Nobunaga, who was busy unifying the country through sheer brutality and tactical genius. Most historical accounts gloss over Yasuke in a paragraph or two, a footnote, an oddity. But when you dig into the Japanese chronicles, Jesuit letters, and military records from that period, a different picture emerges. This wasn't some token gesture. Yasuke fought in actual battles. He lived in Nobunaga's castle. He was given privileges that most Japanese warriors spent their entire lives trying to earn. So how does an African man become a samurai in feudal Japan? And why has his story been buried for centuries? Let's start with what we know for certain. The earliest confirmed record of Yasuke appears in 1579, when he accompanied the Italian Jesuit Alessandro Valignano to Japan. Valignano was the visitor of missions in the Indies, essentially an inspector for Jesuit operations across Asia. He brought Yasuke as a bodyguard or servant. The exact relationship isn't clear from the records. What is clear is that Yasuke was tall, extraordinarily strong, and unlike anyone the Japanese had ever seen. When they arrived in the capital, chaos erupted. Not violence, curiosity. Crowds swarmed to see this mysterious figure. People climbed on top of each other for a glimpse. The crush became so intense that several people were trampled to death. Think about that for a moment. In a society where public order was maintained through strict social codes and the constant threat of execution, people were willing to risk their lives just to see someone different. The Japanese initially didn't believe Yasuke's skin color was real. They thought it was ink or paint. Some accounts describe Japanese nobles ordering him to strip and scrub his skin to reveal the real color beneath. When nothing changed, their fascination only intensified. Here was proof that the world was far larger and stranger than their isolated islands had led them to believe. But fascination alone doesn't make you a samurai. That required something else entirely. It required catching the attention of Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was not a sentimental man. He'd ordered the massacre of tens of thousands. He burned Buddhist temples to the ground when they opposed him. He executed family members who showed disloyalty. This was a man who played the brutal game of feudal politics without hesitation or mercy. But he also had an unusual mind. He loved novelty, new technology, foreign ideas, anything that gave him an edge over his enemies. When Nobunaga heard about the African giant causing riots in the streets, he demanded to see Yasuke immediately. The Jesuits brought him to Nobunaga's castle. What happened next changed everything. Nobunaga was captivated, not just by Yasuke's appearance, but by his strength and bearing. The chronicles describe Nobunaga personally examining Yasuke, fascinated by his physique and intelligence. They communicated somehow, though we don't know if Yasuke spoke Japanese, Portuguese, or some mixture. What we do know is that Nobunaga made an unprecedented decision. He asked the Jesuits if he could keep Yasuke, not as a slave, as a retainer. The Jesuits agreed. Maybe they saw political advantage in having one of their people close to Japan's most powerful warlord. Maybe Yasuke himself wanted to stay. The records don't tell us. What they do tell us is that Nobunaga gave Yasuke a Japanese name, a house, a stipend, and most importantly, a sword. In feudal Japan, carrying a sword wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a legal privilege reserved for the samurai class. Peasants caught carrying swords could be executed on the spot. By giving Yasuke a sword, Nobunaga was making a declaration. This man is samurai. This man has status. This man is under my protection. And Yasuke didn't waste the opportunity. He became part of Nobunaga's personal guard. He accompanied the warlord on military campaigns. He was present during strategic meetings. Japanese sources describe him as having the strength of 10 men, though that's likely exaggeration mixed with awe. What isn't exaggeration is that he fought, he bled. He earned his place not through novelty, but through service. Think about the psychological weight of that position. You're in a completely foreign culture. You don't look like anyone else. You can't fully understand the language. Every social rule, every gesture, every ritual is alien, and you're expected to perform at the highest level in one of the most demanding warrior cultures in human history. One mistake could mean not just your death, but dishonor. Yet Yasuke adapted. The historical records show no signs of failure or disgrace during his time with Nobunaga. In fact, they show the opposite. He rose in prominence. Other samurai accepted him. He became a trusted member of Nobunaga's inner circle during the most critical period of Japanese unification. But history has a way of taking unexpected turns, and Yasuke's story was about to take its most dramatic one yet. By 1582, Nobunaga was at the height of his power. He controlled most of central Japan. His enemies were scattered or dead. Unification seemed inevitable. But in feudal Japan, trust was a luxury no one could afford, not even from your closest allies. One of Nobunaga's generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, had been nursing a grievance. Maybe it was a personal insult, maybe political calculation. The exact reason remains debated by historians. What isn't debated is what happened next. Mitsuhide marched his army to Kyoto, where Nobunaga was staying at a temple called Honnoji. He surrounded the temple in the early morning hours, and he attacked. Nobunaga woke to find himself trapped. His personal guard numbered only about 30 men. They were vastly outnumbered. There was no escape, no reinforcements coming, just a final stand against impossible odds. Yasuke was there. He fought alongside his lord as the temple burned. The accounts describe fierce resistance, but the outcome was never in doubt. Nobunaga, seeing the situation was hopeless, retreated to an inner chamber and committed seppuku, ritual suicide, the honorable death of a samurai. And that's where Yasuke's story takes its strangest turn. Because what happened to him next reveals just how complicated his position really was. After Nobunaga's death, Yasuke could have fled. He could have hidden. Instead, he joined Nobunaga's son and heir, Nobutada, who was at a nearby castle. They prepared for a final defense, but Mitsuhide's forces were too many. The castle fell. Nobutada, like his father, chose death over capture, and Yasuke was taken prisoner. Here's where the story becomes fascinatingly ambiguous. Mitsuhide could have executed Yasuke immediately. He'd just killed the most powerful man in Japan. One more body wouldn't matter. But instead, Mitsuhide made a curious decision. He sent Yasuke to a Jesuit mission, alive, unharmed, with instructions to hand him over to the priests. The official explanation, recorded in Japanese sources, was that Yasuke was not Japanese and therefore did not know anything. He was an animal, the records claim, not a person who understood Bushido. This sounds like racism dressed up as mercy, but read between the lines and something else emerges. Mitsuhide was facing a legitimacy crisis. He'd just assassinated his lord, the worst crime in samurai culture. Every warlord in Japan would be hunting him. The last thing he needed was to execute a foreign samurai who technically wasn't part of the political game. Killing Yasuke would be pointless brutality. It would offend the Jesuits, who still had diplomatic importance. It would waste a curiosity that might have value later, and perhaps most importantly, it would cement Mitsuhide's image as a monster rather than a justified rebel. So he let him go, or more accurately, he handed him off and pretended he never existed. And that's where the historical record goes silent. We know Yasuke was turned over to the Jesuits. We know he survived the Honnoji incident. But after that, nothing. No death record, no departure record, no mention in subsequent documents. He vanishes from history as abruptly as he appeared. Some historians believe he was sent back to India or Africa with the Jesuits. Others think he may have stayed in Japan, living quietly outside the samurai class. There are unverified stories of a black man in Kyushu decades later, but nothing concrete. The most likely scenario is he left Japan entirely. Without Nobunaga's protection, his position was impossible. He couldn't return to being property. He couldn't remain a masterless samurai. His very existence was a political complication. So Yasuke disappears, and for over 400 years he remained a footnote, a curiosity mentioned briefly in Japanese histories, usually in the context of Nobunaga's eccentricities. Western historians barely knew he existed. Then something changed. In recent decades, Yasuke has been rediscovered, not by accident but through deliberate excavation of sources that had always been there. Japanese historians began taking his story seriously. International scholars started connecting dots across continents. And suddenly, this man who'd been dismissed as a novelty became something else entirely. A symbol, a question mark, a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about how we tell history. Because Yasuke's story forces us to confront assumptions we didn't know we had. When we picture feudal Japan, we see a homogeneous society, isolated, ethnically uniform. But that's a modern construction. The Japan of the 1500s was deeply connected to global trade networks. Portuguese, Dutch, and Spanish merchants were regular visitors. Chinese traders had been coming for centuries. The idea of a pure Japanese culture existing in isolation is a myth. Yasuke wasn't an anomaly. He was evidence of a more complex reality. And his rise to samurai status challenges another assumption. That race, as we understand it today, the rigid categories, the hierarchies, operated the same way everywhere. It didn't. Nobunaga didn't see Yasuke through the lens of 19th century scientific racism. He saw a capable man who could serve a purpose. The discrimination Yasuke faced was real, but it was different. Cultural, not biological. Xenophobic, not racial in the modern sense. This distinction matters because it reveals that racism isn't some eternal constant. It's constructed, it changes, and therefore it can be dismantled. Now, Yasuke's story has been romanticized. There's no question. He's appeared in anime, video games, and novels. Some depictions are historically grounded, others are pure fantasy, and that sparked debate. Is it appropriate to turn a real person into entertainment? Does fictionalizing Yasuke honor his legacy or distort it? The answer isn't simple. On one hand, these stories have made Yasuke visible. They've sparked interest in actual history. People who'd never crack open a Japanese history book have learned about the Sengoku period because of a video game character. That's not nothing. But there's also risk. When fiction becomes more famous than fact, the real person gets lost. Yasuke becomes a symbol, a mascot, a marketing tool. His actual life, the complexity, the contradictions, the unknowns, all of it gets flattened into a narrative that's easier to sell. Take the recent controversy around his inclusion in a major video game. Some celebrated it as representation, others claimed it was historical revisionism. The debate became a proxy war for larger cultural battles, and in the noise, Yasuke himself, the actual historical figure, got lost. Here's what we know for certain. Yasuke existed. He came to Japan. He served Nobunaga. He fought in battles. He was given samurai status. He survived his lord's assassination. Everything else is interpretation, educated guessing, or creative license. And maybe that's fitting, because Yasuke's story has always been about what we choose to see. Nobunaga saw a warrior. Mitsuhide saw a non-person. The Jesuits saw a curiosity. Modern audiences see representation, controversy, or inspiration, depending on their perspective. But strip away the projections, and you're left with something irreducible. A man who crossed an ocean he didn't choose to cross, who learned a language he didn't expect to speak, who entered a culture that had no category for him, and who, despite impossible odds, carved out a place for himself in one of history's most rigid hierarchies. That's not a story about representation. It's a story about survival, about adaptation, about the strange alchemy that happens when cultures collide and someone refuses to be crushed in the collision. The records are frustratingly sparse. We'll never know what Yasuke thought about any of this, whether he felt pride or alienation, whether he considered himself samurai or prisoner, whether he missed his homeland or had made peace with never returning. What we do know is this. For a brief moment in history, the rules bent. A man who wasn't supposed to exist in that context did anyway, and the system, inflexible as it seemed, accommodated him, not out of enlightenment, but out of pragmatism. Nobunaga needed capable people. Yasuke was capable. Therefore, Yasuke was samurai. It's a transactional view of identity, almost cynical, but it also suggests something radical, that these categories we treat as fixed, samurai, foreigner, insider, outsider, they're more fluid than we admit. They can be crossed, not easily, not often, but it's possible. And that possibility is what makes Yasuke's story resonate today. We live in a world obsessed with identity. Who belongs where? Who has the right to claim what? These questions dominate our politics, our culture, our daily interactions. And history offers few clear answers. But Yasuke offers something else. Not an answer, but a precedent. Someone who didn't fit, who shouldn't have made it, who by all logic should have remained invisible, and yet didn't. His story is incomplete, frustratingly so. We want resolution. We want to know how it ended, whether he found peace, whether he returned home, whether he died in battle or old age or somewhere in between. But history doesn't owe us closure. What it offers instead is a fragment, a glimpse, a crack in the official narrative wide enough to see that the past was stranger, more diverse, and more complicated than we've been told. And sometimes a fragment is enough, because fragments make us curious. They make us question. They remind us that for every story preserved in official records, 1,000 others were lost, not because they didn't matter, but because no one thought to write them down. Yasuke almost became one of those lost stories. For centuries, he was barely a footnote, but fragments have a way of resurfacing, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. The implications ripple outward. If a black samurai could exist in 16th century Japan, what else are we missing? What other impossible stories are hiding in plain sight, dismissed as anomalies or inventions? How much of history is just the stories we've agreed to tell, and how much is waiting to be rediscovered? Yasuke's story raises an uncomfortable question, not about him, but about us. Why does it matter so much whether he was really a samurai? Why does that label carry such weight? Because titles are how we organize memory. They're shortcuts. Samurai means warrior, honor, loyalty, discipline. It means someone who matters in the historical record, someone worth remembering. Strip away the title and suddenly the story feels less solid, less official, like it might not count. But that's the trap. We're so focused on whether Yasuke earned the proper credentials that we miss the more radical truth. He existed in a place where someone like him wasn't supposed to exist, and not just existed, survived, thrived even, for a while. The historical records from Japan's Sengoku period are vast. Thousands upon thousands of documents, battle reports, land surveys, temple registries, personal diaries. Yasuke appears in exactly 3 of them. 3, that's not because he was insignificant, it's because most people, even important people, barely appear in the historical record at all. We've built entire mythologies around samurai culture based on a tiny fraction of documented lives. So when someone like Yasuke shows up, even briefly, it's not a curiosity, it's a crack in the facade, evidence that the official story was never the whole story, that countless lives moved through these periods leaving no trace whatsoever. Yasuke only survived in writing because he was attached to Nobunaga. Without that connection, he'd be invisible, completely erased. Which means there were probably others, not necessarily other African men in Japan, but other anomalies, other people who didn't fit the categories, who existed in the gaps between what the records captured and what actually happened. History has a tendency to smooth things out, to make the past seem more orderly than it was, more consistent, more explainable. The reality was chaos, especially during the Sengoku period, when Japan was literally tearing itself apart. Warlords rose and fell, alliances shifted overnight, entire clans were wiped out, foreigners arrived with strange weapons and stranger religions. Nothing was stable. In that chaos, someone like Yasuke could slip through. Not because the system welcomed him, but because the system was too busy eating itself to enforce its own rules consistently. Nobunaga was already breaking conventions left and right. He armed peasants. He promoted merchants. He burned monasteries. Adding a foreign warrior to his retinue wasn't progressive politics. It was Tuesday. But then Nobunaga died, and everything changed. Here's what we know about Yasuke's final appearance in the historical record. It's June 1582. Nobunaga has been betrayed by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, and forced to commit seppuku at Honnoji Temple. Yasuke is there. He fights. He survives the initial assault. Then he makes his way to Nijo Castle, where Nobunaga's son and heir, Oda Nobutada, is making a last stand. Yasuke fights again. The castle falls, Nobutada dies, and Yasuke is captured by Akechi's forces. This is where the story gets strange, or stranger. According to the Jesuit records, Akechi's men didn't know what to do with him. They brought him to Akechi himself, and Akechi made a decision that's been debated ever since. He released him, handed him over to the Jesuits, told his men that Yasuke was an animal and knew nothing, therefore not worth killing. On the surface, this looks like contempt. Akechi refusing to acknowledge Yasuke as a legitimate warrior. But look closer. Akechi just killed his lord and his lord's son. He's consolidating power. He's executing everyone connected to Nobunaga's inner circle, everyone who might threaten his claim or rally opposition. Except Yasuke. Yasuke gets sent away, unharmed. That's not contempt, that's calculation. Akechi couldn't afford to kill Yasuke because doing so would acknowledge what Yasuke was, a samurai, someone who deserved a warrior's death. By declaring him an outsider, an animal, someone who knew nothing, Akechi could release him without losing face, without admitting that he'd just captured one of Nobunaga's actual retainers. It's an insult designed to save Yasuke's life. Whether Yasuke understood that, whether he felt grateful or enraged, we'll never know. The Jesuit records mention his transfer to their custody, and then nothing. He vanishes from history completely. No death record, no mention of him returning to India or Africa, no appearance in later documents, just gone, as if he'd never existed at all, except he did exist. And his disappearance from the record doesn't erase that. It just reminds us how fragile historical memory really is, how much depends on who's writing things down and what they think matters. The Jesuits wrote about Yasuke because he was exotic, a curiosity, proof that their mission was reaching unexpected places and people. Japanese chroniclers mentioned him because he was attached to Nobunaga. Once that attachment ended, so did their interest. He became irrelevant, not worth the ink. That's how most lives end up, not recorded, not remembered, not because they didn't matter, but because the machinery of history isn't designed to capture everyone. It's designed to capture power, wealth, violence. Anything that doesn't fit those categories has to fight twice as hard just to leave a trace. Yasuke left a trace, barely, just enough for us to know he was there, just enough to know that something remarkable happened, but not enough to satisfy our curiosity, not enough to answer the questions we want answered. Where did he go after Honnoji? Did he try to return home? Did he stay in Japan, living quietly somewhere outside the historical record's reach? Did he die shortly after, a casualty of the chaos that followed Nobunaga's death? We don't know. We'll probably never know. But here's what's fascinating. His absence from later records might be the most revealing thing about him, because it suggests he successfully disappeared, that he removed himself from the structures of power that had briefly made him visible, that he found a way to exist outside the system entirely. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he died anonymously and quickly. Maybe his story ended in some forgotten battlefield or nameless village. Maybe the reason we can't find him is because there was nothing left to find. Both possibilities are true in their own way. Both versions of Yasuke exist simultaneously. The warrior who fought beside one of Japan's most powerful warlords, and the man who vanished without ceremony or explanation. History gave us the first, the silence gives us the second. And that silence, frustrating as it is, might be more honest than any definitive ending could be. Because most lives don't end with clear resolution. They just stop. The record moves on. Other names take precedence. The machinery of history keeps grinding, indifferent to the gaps it creates. Yasuke fell into one of those gaps, but he fell into it after doing something almost no one else in his position could have done. He made it into the record at all, against every structural barrier, against every assumption about who mattered and who didn't. He forced his way into documents that weren't meant to include him. That's not nothing. That's not erasure. That's evidence of a life lived with enough force, enough presence, that even a system designed to ignore him couldn't completely succeed. The question isn't whether Yasuke was a real samurai. The question is why we need him to be. What are we trying to prove? That the past was more inclusive than we thought? That these rigid hierarchies had secret flexibility? That identity is performance, and anyone can claim any role if they're skilled enough? Maybe all of those, maybe none. Maybe we're just hungry for stories that complicate the narrative, that prove the past wasn't as monolithic as the official records suggest, that show us people who refuse to accept the limitations imposed on them. Yasuke didn't set out to be a symbol. He was just trying to survive, to adapt, to find a place in a world that had no category for him. The fact that he succeeded, even temporarily, even incompletely, is remarkable enough. We don't need to turn him into something more. We don't need to retrofit him into modern frameworks of representation or identity politics. What we need to do is sit with the discomfort of not knowing, of having a story that doesn't resolve cleanly, of understanding that history is full of these fragments, these partial glimpses, these moments where someone unexpected appears and then vanishes before we can fully understand what their presence meant. Because that's closer to truth than any definitive narrative could be. The past wasn't orderly, it wasn't consistent, it was full of contradictions, accidents, and people who existed in spaces they weren't supposed to occupy. Yasuke was one of them, and his story, incomplete as it is, proves that the boundaries we think were absolute were actually far more permeable than anyone wanted to admit. The myth-making started almost immediately after Yasuke disappeared from the record. And it never really stopped. Within decades, accounts of a black samurai began appearing in Japanese oral tradition. Stories passed between generations, some accurate, most embellished, a few completely fabricated. The problem with trying to trace these stories is that they emerged from a culture that valued narrative cohesion over documentary precision. Japanese storytelling tradition wasn't about preserving facts, it was about preserving meaning. And Yasuke's meaning shifted depending on who was telling the story and why. In some versions, he became a tragic figure, a loyal warrior who died defending Nobunaga's heir. In others, he was a comic character, a bumbling foreigner who misunderstood Japanese customs and provided entertainment at court. Still others cast him as a villain, an outsider who brought bad luck to the Oda clan. Each version tells us less about Yasuke and more about what the storyteller needed him to represent. By the Edo period, roughly 50 years after Yasuke's disappearance, Japan had closed itself off from most foreign contact. The government expelled missionaries. Trade was restricted to a single port. Christianity was banned. And the memory of that brief moment when foreigners had access to the highest levels of power became uncomfortable. Stories like Yasuke's were either sanitized or quietly forgotten. But they didn't vanish entirely. They went underground, kept alive in regional folklore, whispered about in port cities where memory of foreign contact lingered longer, preserved in fragments by families who claimed connection to the events, however tenuous. Then came the modern era, and with it a complete reframing. When Japan reopened to the West in the 19th century, Yasuke's story re-emerged, but this time through a different lens. Western observers, eager to find precedents for racial integration in Japanese history, seized on him as proof that Edo period isolation had been an aberration, that Japan had once been more cosmopolitan, more accepting, that the rigid hierarchies of the Tokugawa shogunate weren't representative of Japanese culture as a whole. This wasn't entirely wrong, but it wasn't entirely honest either. It projected contemporary values backward, used Yasuke as evidence in arguments he never would have understood, turned his survival into a moral lesson about tolerance that the historical context simply doesn't support. Because here's what gets lost in these retellings. Yasuke wasn't accepted because 16th century Japan was progressive. He was accepted because he was useful, because Nobunaga saw strategic value in him, because his presence served specific political and psychological purposes. The moment those purposes ended, so did his protection. That's not a story about inclusion, it's a story about power, about how individuals can be temporarily elevated when their presence benefits those in authority, and how quickly they can be discarded when circumstances change. Modern retellings struggle with this. They want Yasuke to be inspirational, a figure who transcended prejudice through skill and determination. And there's truth in that version, but it's incomplete. It ignores the structural realities that shaped every moment of his experience. The fact that he was property before he was a person, that his agency was always contingent, that even at the height of his status he existed at someone else's pleasure. The contemporary fascination with Yasuke exploded in the 21st century. Video games cast him as a protagonist. Anime reimagined him as a supernatural warrior. Hollywood announced multiple competing film projects, each version more fantastical than the last. And with each adaptation, the historical Yasuke receded further into the background. This isn't necessarily bad. Myth-making serves a purpose. It allows cultures to explore ideas through familiar frameworks, to ask questions about identity, belonging, and power without getting bogged down in historical minutiae. Fiction can access emotional truths that documentary evidence can't. But there's a cost. When the myth becomes more prominent than the history, we lose something important. We lose the messiness, the contradiction, the uncomfortable realization that Yasuke's story doesn't provide easy answers to the questions we want to ask. Take the samurai question. Modern audiences want a clear yes or no. Was he or wasn't he? But that question assumes samurai was a fixed category with clear boundaries. It wasn't. The word itself meant different things in different contexts. A warrior who served a lord, a member of the hereditary military class, someone with specific legal privileges, someone who embodied particular cultural values. Yasuke might have fit some of those definitions. He definitely didn't fit others. And the people around him probably didn't spend much time worrying about the classification. They knew what he was in practical terms, a fighter in Nobunaga's service, a visible symbol of the warlord's power and eccentricity, someone whose presence needed explanation but whose role was essentially understood. It's only later, when we're trying to make sense of him from a distance, that the categories become important, because we need them to contextualize his significance, to measure his achievement, to decide whether his story represents breakthrough or anomaly. The truth is probably both, and neither. What's certain is that Yasuke's presence in Nobunaga's service was documented. Multiple sources confirm it. His appearance was noted. His role in at least one military campaign was recorded. His survival after Nobunaga's death was acknowledged by the man who could have killed him. These aren't ambiguous facts. They're established historical events. Everything else, interpretation, the meaning we assign, the importance we claim, the lessons we extract, those belong to us, not to history. And the modern versions of Yasuke's story reveal more about contemporary anxieties than about 16th century Japan. We're asking him to carry weight he was never meant to bear, to represent struggles he didn't experience in those terms, to embody victories that weren't recognized as such in his lifetime. This happens constantly with historical figures who exist at the margins of official record. We fill the silences with our own voices, project our values backward, claim them as ancestors for causes that didn't exist in their world. It's understandable, even inevitable, but it's also dangerous, because it allows us to avoid confronting the actual conditions that shaped their lives, the systems that determined who got remembered and who got erased, the structures that made someone like Yasuke remarkable in the first place. If Yasuke had been Japanese, his story wouldn't be remarkable. A capable warrior rising through the ranks during the Sengoku period wasn't unusual. It happened constantly. What makes his story notable is that he wasn't Japanese, that he came from somewhere that shouldn't have given him access to these opportunities, that he ended up in a position that violated every assumption about how hierarchy worked. That's the actual story, not that he transcended prejudice, but that prejudice existed and shaped every aspect of his experience, that he navigated a system designed to exclude him, that his success was conditional, temporary, and ultimately vulnerable to forces completely outside his control. The modern retellings smooth over these complications. They want triumph. They want representation. They want proof that barriers can be overcome through individual excellence. And Yasuke's story can be twisted to support that narrative if you ignore enough context. But the context is the story. The context is what makes it meaningful. Strip that away and you're left with fantasy. Entertaining, perhaps. Inspiring, maybe. But fundamentally disconnected from the historical reality that gave it weight. So where does that leave us? Caught between incomplete historical evidence and oversimplified modern mythology, between a figure we can barely see and versions of him that reveal more about us than about him. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe that tension is exactly where Yasuke belongs, in the space between what we know and what we imagine, between documentation and speculation, between the person he was and the symbol he became, because that's where most historical truth lives, not in certainty, not in definitive narratives, but in the uncomfortable recognition that the past is always partially obscured, that our understanding is always filtered through multiple layers of interpretation, translation, and projection. Yasuke survived in the historical record because he was exceptional, but he's survived in cultural memory because we needed him to be, because his story, fragmentary as it is, offers something we can't find in more completely documented lives, a glimpse of radical possibility, evidence that the boundaries we think were absolute were actually negotiable under the right circumstances, whether those circumstances were liberating or exploitative, whether his experience represented progress or anomaly, whether his legacy should inspire or caution us. These are questions without simple answers. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the value of Yasuke's story isn't in what it proves, but in what it forces us to question, about how history gets written, about whose stories survive and why, about the difference between being remembered and being understood. The man himself remains elusive, lost somewhere between the fragments of historical record and the layers of myth that have accumulated over centuries. We can't recover him, can't speak for him, can't claim to understand what his experience actually meant from his perspective, but we can recognize that he existed, that he mattered enough to be recorded, that his presence disrupted expectations and created complications that historians are still trying to untangle. That's not the ending anyone wants, but it might be the most honest one we can offer. The fragments we have don't tell us what Yasuke thought, whether he saw himself as fortunate or trapped, whether he embraced his position or simply endured it, whether he understood the cultural significance of what was happening or just tried to survive day by day. We project onto him constantly, interpret his silence as dignity, his survival as triumph, his service as choice. But silence is just silence. Survival is just not dying. Service under a warlord in 16th century Japan wasn't really about choice at all. What we do know is this: he was visible, impossibly, unavoidably visible, in a society where visibility of that kind was dangerous. Every room he entered, every street he walked, every battlefield he stood on, he was marked, different, other. That didn't make him special in any romantic sense. It made him vulnerable. The accounts we have focus on his appearance precisely because that's what made him noteworthy to Japanese observers. His utility to Nobunaga was partly tied to that visibility, the shock value, the statement of power that came from having someone so unusual in his retinue. Strip away the novelty, and what remains? A soldier among soldiers, a retainer among retainers, competent probably, trusted possibly, but fundamentally dependent on the whims of a single volatile man in an extraordinarily violent period. When Nobunaga died, that protection evaporated instantly. Yasuke didn't flee, didn't disappear into the countryside. He fought for Nobunaga's heir until that fight became impossible. Then he was captured and released because Akechi Mitsuhide didn't consider him Japanese enough to execute as a traitor. Think about that. His foreignness, which had elevated him, now saved him through dismissal. He wasn't important enough to kill, wasn't really part of the conflict in any meaningful way despite having been at its center. That's the reality behind the legend. Conditional inclusion that could be revoked the moment circumstances shifted. After that, nothing. No records, no mentions. He vanishes from history as abruptly as he entered it. Maybe he survived for years. Maybe he died within weeks. Maybe he found other employment, other patrons, other battles. Maybe he tried to leave Japan entirely. We don't know. Can't know. The silence is complete, and that silence tells its own story about who mattered enough to track, whose fate was considered worth recording, whose life, once it stopped being useful or interesting to powerful people, simply ceased to exist in the historical record. That's not unique to Yasuke. Most people in history vanish this way, their stories truncated, their endings unknown. But it's particularly stark here because his visibility was so extreme, from being notable enough to appear in multiple contemporary accounts to disappearing without trace. The modern fascination makes sense. We're drawn to figures who crossed boundaries, who complicate our understanding of the past, who suggests that the rigid categories we assume existed were actually more fluid than we thought. Yasuke does all that. His existence proves that a black man could rise to samurai status in feudal Japan. That's historically significant, worth studying, worth acknowledging. But significance isn't the same as triumph. Complication isn't the same as liberation. His story doesn't prove that 16th century Japan was some kind of post-racial meritocracy. It proves the opposite, that race and origin mattered enormously, that his position was exceptional precisely because it violated norms, that the system didn't change to accommodate him, it just made a temporary exception. And when that exception was no longer convenient, it ended. The fictional versions of Yasuke's life keep proliferating. Books, games, films, comics, each one filling the gaps with imagination, creating motivations and relationships and dramatic arcs that the historical record can't support or refute. Some are thoughtful, acknowledging the limitations of what we know. Others are pure fantasy, using his name and basic outline, but inventing everything else. Neither approach is inherently wrong. Fiction serves different purposes than history, but they get confused. The invented details bleed into popular understanding. People encounter the fictionalized Yasuke first, then encounter the historical fragments, and assume the fiction filled in truth rather than gaps. This happens with many historical figures, but it's particularly pronounced here because the gaps are so large and the desire for certain kinds of stories is so strong. We want tales of triumph over adversity. We want proof that excellence can overcome prejudice. We want historical precedent for modern ideals. Yasuke's story can be shaped to provide all that if you squint hard enough and ignore the parts that don't fit. But doing that doesn't honor him. It uses him, transforms him from a person who lived a specific complicated life into a tool for contemporary cultural arguments he had no stake in. He becomes less real the more famous he gets, less himself, and more whatever we need him to be. The responsible approach is harder. It requires sitting with uncertainty, acknowledging what we don't know, resisting the urge to fill gaps with assumptions, recognizing that someone's historical importance doesn't require their life to have been triumphant or inspirational. Yasuke matters because he was there, because his presence is documented, because he complicates narratives about racial exclusion in ways that make both simple celebration and simple condemnation inadequate. That's enough. It has to be, because anything more is speculation. What we're left with is a handful of references, a few paragraphs in letters, brief mentions in chronicles, physical descriptions but almost no direct quotes, actions recorded but motivations unrecorded, a trajectory that rises sharply and ends abruptly. That's the complete archive. Everything else is extrapolation, interpretation, educated guessing, or outright invention. Some of that interpretive work is valuable, helps us understand context, draw connections, recognize patterns, but it's still interpretation, still one step removed from the actual person who lived this life. And we need to maintain that distinction between what the sources tell us and what we've constructed around them. The obsession with Yasuke says more about our moment than his. We're desperate for historical figures who challenge our assumptions about the past, who prove that barriers we think were absolute were actually permeable, who demonstrate that diversity and inclusion aren't just modern concerns, but have precedents reaching back centuries. Yasuke can be made to serve all those purposes, but only by simplifying his story, by smoothing over the violence, exploitation, and precarity that defined his experience, by treating his exceptional status as aspirational rather than isolating, by assuming that being remembered is the same as being free. He wasn't free. That's the part that gets lost. He was property, then he was a retainer, then he was a prisoner, then he was nothing the historical record cared about. At no point did he control his own narrative. At no point did his voice get preserved in a way that would let us understand his perspective. We have descriptions of him, but nothing from him. That absence is itself meaningful, tells us about power, about whose words mattered, about the difference between being seen and being heard. He was extremely visible, but entirely voiceless in the archive. That contradiction is the story, not the rise, not the fall, but the fact that he could be central to events and still fundamentally peripheral to how those events got recorded. Maybe that's why his story resonates, because that tension between visibility and voicelessness, between being used as symbol and remaining unknown as person, between mattering and not mattering, is something many people recognize. The specifics of his experience are unique, but the underlying dynamic isn't. Plenty of people throughout history have been noticed without being understood, used without being valued, remembered without being known. Yasuke just happened to be extraordinary enough that his version of that experience left traces we can still find centuries later. So we circle back to where we started, with fragments, with uncertainty, with a figure who existed but remains fundamentally unknowable. The facts are sparse, the context is brutal, the ending is ambiguous. That's not satisfying, doesn't provide closure or clear lessons, doesn't let us claim him for any particular interpretation with complete confidence. but it's honest. And maybe honesty is more valuable than satisfaction. Maybe sitting with the discomfort of not knowing is more respectful than pretending we do. Maybe Yasuke's real legacy isn't inspiration or representation, but something harder. A reminder that history is full of people whose lives were complex, whose experiences were contradictory, whose stories resist the neat categories we try to impose on them. People who were there, who mattered, who left marks we can still see but whose actual humanity remains just out of reach. That's Yasuke, present but absent, documented but mysterious, historical but somehow still unreal, caught forever between the fragments that prove he existed and the silence that prevents us from truly knowing him. The real question isn't whether we've finally figured out who Yasuke was. It's whether that question even makes sense. We keep trying to pin him down. Samurai or servant, hero or victim, symbol or cautionary tale. But maybe the answer is that he was just a person, someone who ended up in circumstances so bizarre that even now, centuries later, we're still trying to make sense of them. History doesn't owe us satisfying narratives, doesn't owe us moral clarity or inspirational arcs. What it offers instead are fragments, pieces of evidence that something happened, someone existed, events unfolded in ways that contradicted what we thought was possible. Yasuke is one of those pieces, proof that the boundaries we imagine were fixed were actually negotiable under specific conditions. That the categories we treat as eternal were actually contingent, temporary, subject to change when circumstances demanded it. But here's what we miss when we focus too much on what his story proves. The person himself, not the symbol, not the representation. The actual human being who woke up every day in a culture he didn't fully understand, speaking a language he'd learned as an adult, navigating social codes that had no space for someone like him. That daily reality, that constant negotiation, that's what gets erased when we turn him into a lesson. He didn't ask to be a teaching tool, didn't volunteer to prove anything about diversity or inclusion or the fluidity of racial categories. He was just trying to survive. And for a brief moment, he did more than survive. He occupied a position that shouldn't have been available, that defied every assumption about how power and status worked. Not because the system was fair, not because Japan in the 16th century had somehow transcended prejudice, but because one extremely powerful man found him useful and interesting enough to break convention. That's not nothing, but it's also not everything. The fact that it happened doesn't mean it was common, doesn't mean others could replicate it, doesn't mean the exception proved anything except that exceptions exist. Yasuke's story is remarkable precisely because it was aberrant. Remove that context and you've removed what made it meaningful in the first place. Modern retellings keep trying to make his story universal, to extract lessons that apply beyond his specific circumstances. And maybe some of those lessons are valid, about resilience, about adaptation, about the unpredictability of history, but they're our lessons, not his. We're reading our values backward, projecting contemporary concerns onto someone who lived in a radically different moral universe. He didn't think in terms of representation or breaking barriers or challenging stereotypes. Those concepts didn't exist. He thought in terms of survival, service, whatever internal life he had that the sources don't capture. The silence around his ending is perfect in its way. Frustrating, yes. Unsatisfying, absolutely. But also somehow appropriate, because it forces us to confront what history actually is. Not a complete record, not a satisfying narrative, just pieces, fragments, moments of visibility separated by vast stretches of darkness. Most people who ever lived left no trace whatsoever. Yasuke left just enough to prove he was there. Just enough to make us curious, but not enough to satisfy that curiosity, not enough to let us claim we understand. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the value of his story isn't in what it tells us about him, but in what it tells us about the limits of historical knowledge, about how much gets lost, about how the people we remember were remembered for reasons that often had nothing to do with who they actually were. Yasuke appears in the record because he was useful to Nobunaga, because his presence served political and psychological purposes. When those purposes ended, so did the documentation. He didn't stop existing. He just stopped mattering to the people who controlled the historical archive. That's a truth that applies far beyond one person. The entire historical record is shaped by power, by who got to write things down, by whose lives were considered worth documenting, by what kinds of information were preserved and what were discarded. We're not looking at the past directly. We're looking at what powerful people thought was important enough to record. Everything else is shadow, inference, educated guessing based on fragments that survived by accident or deliberate choice. Yasuke survived in the record by accident. If he'd served a less famous lord, we'd have nothing. If Akechi had killed him instead of releasing him, the references would be even sparser. His visibility in history is contingent on factors completely outside his control, and that contingency is itself revealing, shows us how arbitrary historical memory really is, how much depends on chance, timing, connection to people who mattered in ways that got documented. The fictional versions of his life keep multiplying because the historical version is unsatisfying. It doesn't provide closure, doesn't answer the questions we want answered. So we fill the gaps with imagination, create motivations, relationships, dramatic arcs that feel true even if they're invented. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. Fiction serves different purposes than history, but the two keep getting confused. People encounter the invented Yasuke and assume that's who he was. The gaps get filled so thoroughly that we forget they were gaps in the first place. What we need instead is comfort with uncertainty. Willingness to say we don't know and sit with that. To recognize that someone can be historically important without us understanding their interior life. That significance doesn't require completeness, that fragments are valuable precisely because they're fragments. They remind us that most of the past is lost, that what we have is miraculous in its survival, but inevitably incomplete. Yasuke matters because he was there, because his presence is documented well enough that we can't dismiss him as legend or invention, because he complicates our understanding of how rigid hierarchies actually functioned, because he proves that the boundaries we think were absolute had exceptions, even if those exceptions were rare and contingent and ultimately vulnerable. That's enough. Has to be, because anything more is speculation disguised as knowledge. The desire to know more is understandable, but it can't be satisfied. The sources don't exist, the voices weren't preserved, the interior experience remains inaccessible. We can describe what happened to him, at least partially, but we can't describe what it felt like, can't access his perspective, can't claim to understand what any of this meant from his point of view. That gap between external event and internal experience is unbridgeable, and pretending otherwise doesn't honor him. It just makes us feel better about the limits of what we can know. So we're left with a story that doesn't resolve, a figure who remains partially obscured no matter how much attention we pay, a life that mattered enough to be recorded, but not completely enough to be understood. That's not the ending anyone wants, not inspiring enough for popular culture, not conclusive enough for academic history, just honest, just real, just a reminder that the past is full of people who existed in ways that challenge our categories, complicate our narratives, and resist our attempts to make them make sense. Yasuke was one of those people. He crossed an ocean, entered a culture, occupied a position, fought in battles, and disappeared. The facts are sparse but solid. The interpretation is endless but uncertain, and the man himself remains exactly where he's always been, just beyond reach, present in the historical record but absent from it in the ways that matter, documented but voiceless, visible but unknown. That's not failure of historical method. That's just what history is: fragments, shadows, traces of lives that happened but can't be fully recovered. And sometimes, a fragment is all we get. Sometimes, that has to be enough.